The sages say that man's greatest enemy is not outside, but within his mind, whispering silently, while his soul, the neshama, tries to speak to God. In the Torah, that voice took the form of a serpent, cunning, persuasive, patient. It didn't attack with venom, but with words. Thousands of years later, that serpent is still alive, not in the Garden of Eden, but within us. It appears when we close our eyes to pray, when we try to concentrate on the Amidah, which is the main prayer throughout the Bible in Judaism. It appears when we want to rise, and something, a subtle voice, drags us down. The rabbis called it Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, distraction, temptation, doubt. Kabbalah describes it as an energy that coils around the soul, waiting for the moment to distract it, the neshama, from the eternal. Today we won't talk about snakes in the desert or bronze on a pole. We'll talk about the invisible serpent that dwells within us, the one that attacks when we try to pray. And above all, how to recognize it and transform it into a force of holiness. We'll also talk about when the heavens turn to bronze, as Moses wrote, and how we can overcome all the obstacles in the spiritual worlds that interfere with and damage prayer so that it doesn't fully reach God. This is Abel Flores. I'm grateful that you continue to study this free course on the Mishnah with us in the Abel Code. Without further ado, let's begin. Well, let's begin our class today. And today we begin a new chapter, chapter 5, of the Mishnah's Tractate of Blessings. So let's read chapter 5, teaching 1, which reads as follows. One should not stand to pray, except with dignity, seriousness. Pious men of the early generations used to wait an hour and then pray, so that they would direct their hearts to the place, to God. Even if the king asked him about his well-being, he would not answer, and even if a snake were to coil around his heel, he would not interrupt. Wow, what a class we have today with the end of this Mishnah. Even if a snake were to coil around his heel, it would not interrupt. How is this possible? Well, we'll be talking about this and more in this class, so get comfortable. The first thing we need to say is that some printed editions of the Mishnah omit the final clause about the serpent, but critical, ancient, and complete translations do include it, and the Talmud discusses it. In other words, if the Gemara discusses the topic of the serpent, it's because the Mishnah, without a modern edition, presents that teaching in its entirety and without any filters. Well, here we learn something very important, and at the same time, be extremely careful with the editions you read, consume, and study. Not all of them respect the original sources. This isn't just a problem of one specific religion. Many Christian and Jewish texts suffer from the same problem. What? They are edited for various reasons, including doctrinal ones, even to avoid controversial topics. Now we are beginning chapter 5 of the Mishnah Berakhot. We continue to discuss the most important prayer in all of the Torah and Judaism, the Amidah, as the central prayer, its preparation, posture, and concentration. Kavanah in Hebrew. But in this chapter, we will look at new concepts, problems, and discussions. The thematic axis is based on 3 normative axes. First, disposition of mind, mitoch koved rosh, seriousness, recollection. Second, prior preparation, the Rishonim Hasidim, that is, the first or ancient pious ones, waited for an hour. And third, no interruption, neither at the greeting of a king nor at the sight of a snake. If we analyze the Hebrew expression mitoch koved rosh, literally heaviness of mind, it literally means heaviness of mind and is equivalent to reverent fear or seriousness. The Bartanura, a classic Jewish work on prayer, links this to Psalm 2:11, which says, "Serve Hashem with fear." The following expression, "Lehachin et libam lamakom," contains a very important detail. Hamakom is one of the 72 names of God and means the place. It designates divine omnipresence, and classically, the site of the temple as the axis between heaven and earth. The Amidah, as standing before God, emphasizes the audience before the sovereign. This requires concentration and ritual etiquette. The Talmudic development, both the Bavli and the Jerusalem Bible, discusses a pause of 1 hour before and an hour after. The Bavli expands that the pious waited an hour before, extended the Amidah by an hour, and waited an hour after, 3 hours per service. The Kana model, 1 Samuel 1, in Berakhot 31a, laws are derived from its prayer. Direct the heart, move the lips, but do not raise the voice. A drunken person should not pray. This passage establishes the standard for kavanah and the tone of the Amidah. Do not interrupt for a king or a serpent. The Bavli and later poskim delimit when it is appropriate to interrupt due to life-threatening circumstances. According to the concept or foundation of the Torpa of pikuach nefesh, which means not risking one's life to fulfill the commandments of the Torah, because it is written, "You shall live for them," not "you shall die for them." The Jerusalem Talmud explains, "A snake, do not interrupt for its sake, but a scorpion, interrupt for the greater risk." In fact, there is a discussion that the Mishna speaks of a snake that is not poisonous, but if it is poisonous, it is mandatory to interrupt to save your life. In the classic halakhic codification, Rambam Maimonides, in his work Mishneh Torah, in the section Hilchot Tefillah 4, requires a state of mind, feeling before the Shekhinah or divine presence, sitting briefly before and after praying. He mentions the triple 1 hour of the pious, who in ancient times prayed up to 3 hours per service. We are talking about the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 93 establishes a prior pause, praying with fear and humility, not from lightness or anger. It establishes mental preparation. Because remember, just as psychologists say, and the sages of Judaism also say, everything is in the mind. By mastering the mind, you master your body, your inclinations. Then there, and only there, can you change the world, but first by changing yourself. And it all begins in the mind, in the imagination, which, as we studied in the last class, can allow you to enter the Holy of Holies at every moment, in every prayer, in every blessing, but it can also lead you astray from the spiritual worlds. Also in Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim 104, it is forbidden to interrupt the Amidah, except in cases of danger. A scorpion is interrupted. A snake is interrupted only if it appears aggressive. It also prohibits moving without speaking. By the way, here's something very important. You have to understand that this Mishnah comes from the 1st century, even from when the temple stood in Jerusalem, in a totally different world, even opposite to ours in the 21st century. That world, that of the 1st century, was practically a rural world, where there were snakes and animals everywhere. Today, especially in cities, this isn't the case, but we can't ignore this teaching either, because today, for example, it's forbidden to pray on a public sidewalk for fear of a passing car putting your life at risk. The important thing is the foundation, the concept that we are being taught. In practical applications, according to the poskim and contemporary guides, the king is sovereign. If the greeting of a non-Jewish king, for example in the Middle Ages, involves real risk by not responding, it is interrupted because of what we've already learned about pikuach nefesh. If there is no risk, one does not respond. This Mishnah speaks of a non-poisonous, non-aggressive snake, so it's recommended not to speak. You can move it so it falls. This isn't considered a verbal interruption. Keep in mind that at that time, 2 millennia ago, people knew how to recognize a poisonous animal from a non-poisonous one, based on the colors, size, and shape of its head. Also, remember that many people were farmers, fishermen, and worked in the fields. Imagine the number of snakes, scorpions, and other animals they were used to seeing. In fact, today, people who live in the countryside, in rural areas, are accustomed to these things. But as we learn from this Mishnah, if it's a poisonous or aggressive scorpion or snake, it's obligatory to stop and call for help to save your life and that of others. Regarding today's preparation for praying the Amidah, which, as you may already know, is prayed 3 times a day, once in the morning shacharit, once in the afternoon mincha, and the third and final time at night arbit. To prepare for reciting the Amidah in the Siddur, or prayer book, there's the famous Pesuke de Zimra, which is a compendium of psalms to lift your spirits and ignite the spiritual engines of your soul. There are also introductory sections that function as a spiritual preparation hour. Many poskim recommend a few minutes of stillness to focus your heart before beginning the prayer. In other words, it's good to arrive at the synagogue or your congregation at least a few minutes early to calm down, focus, meditate a bit, relax, breathe, and be ready for when the prayer begins. There is an implicit theology here. Prayer as appearance. The Amidah is a private audience before God, hence the standing posture, silence, and prohibition of distractions. The Mishna is not ascetic, but intentional. It prioritizes kavanah and the continuity of the bond. Incidentally, it is important to note that one should only stand during the Amidah or Shemoneh Esrei, but for the rest of the prayers, the psalms, and everything else, you can sit. There is also a debate about when to refrain from praying. Some sages in Berakhot 30b suggest not starting if one cannot achieve kavanah. Halakha demands a serious effort at concentration and avoiding praying in states that compromise it, such as anger or intoxication. In normative summary, Berakhot 5.1 establishes that the Amidah is begun only with seriousness and submission, after mental preparation, and is not interrupted except in the case of real danger, a principle codified by Rambam Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch, and developed by later poskim to what applies today. Now let's delve deeper into the lesson. Let's delve into a deeper level of interpretation. What Kabbalah says about the serpent, in Hebrew, nachash. In the Hebrew Bible, the serpent appears in various roles and functions, as a temptress in Eden, according to Genesis 3, a therapeutic instrument, and later as an object of forbidden worship, according to Numbers 21, and also in 2 Kings 18, a symbol of chaotic or monstrous forces as Isaiah 27:1 and 14:29. Rabbinic exegesis has multiplied its interpretations: royal animal, evil inclination, vehicle of Samael. Kabbalah integrates it into the other side, Sitra Achra. In extra-biblical Jewish and Gnostic sources, its figure is reinterpreted, sometimes identified with a demon, other times as an instructor. But let's start with the serpent in the Torah. In Genesis 3, in the Garden of Eden, the woman is tempted in chapter 3 of Genesis and cursed to crawl and eat dust. The base text does not identify her with Satan. However, early midrashim discuss her cunning and motives. You should also know that the word Satan in Hebrew means adversary or opponent, and is not a name or title, although it appears that way in translations. You should know that all translations are interpretive, and at worst, doctrinal. In the Torah, in Numbers 21, copper serpent, in Hebrew, nachash nechoshet, by divine command, Moses makes a copper and bronze serpent on a pole. Looking at it, heals those bitten by fiery serpents, seraphim. Later, King Hezekiah destroys the object, called Nehushtan, for improper worship, for idolatry. Etymologically, Nehushtan plays on Nachash, serpent, and Nehoshet, copper. Archaeological finds show bronze serpents used in the cult in the region, meaning there is archaeological evidence of this today. In the prophets and Ketuvim, there are symbols and beasts, such as the Leviathan, which is called the fleeing or crooked serpent that God will strike down, as Isaiah 27:1 says. The prophet Isaiah also alludes to a flying fiery serpent, according to Isaiah 14:29, a category linked to seraph, fiery, like the serpents in the desert in the time of Moses. Medieval exegetes such as Ibn Ezra, Rashi, and the Targum Yonatan comment on its danger and political metaphor. In Rabbinic Judaism, as in the Talmud and Midrash, there is no original satanic identity. Classical Judaism distinguishes, in Genesis 3, it is an animal of the field. The direct identification with Satan comes in later literature, close to the time of the Second Temple and the return of the exiles to Babylon. Even so, Rabbinism explores symbolic connections between the serpent, the Yetzer Hara, which is the evil inclination, and the accuser, Satan. But never in Judaism or the Torah is there a reference to the devil or a god opposed to the Creator described in the Bible. You should know that these are ideas and doctrines foreign to Judaism, even to early Christianity, and were planted or adopted at a later time as part of the globalization that even existed in the ancient world, so to speak. There are midrashim that discuss the serpent. For example, Bereshit Rabbah analyzes its cunning and influence over women. Traditions describe it with legs before the curse, and even ridden by Samael, a demon described in Kabbalah. Thus, we have halakhic resonances, echoes of Berakhot 5.1, which is our Mishna studied today. The image of the serpent on the heel in the Amidah is integrated into norms about not interrupting unless there is life-threatening danger, as we already explained based on the discussion in the Talmud and Poskim. This reflects the ambivalence between physical danger and the moral symbol. Maimonides, in his famous book, Guide for the Perplexed, which is addressed to people far from faith and Judaism, favors an allegorical reading. The serpent represents the appetitive faculty subordinated to the imagination rather than the intellect. The episode in Eden codifies a moral intellectual anthropology. Academic studies reflect this line of thought, and Ramban Nachmani's more literal symbolic comments on the enmity between humanity and the serpent and its moral interpretation. As it is written in Genesis 3:15, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. It will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel." The Mishnah we studied today has a direct reference to this verse. The serpent is the Yetzer Hara that dwells between the body and the Ruach, which is the spirit where the emotions reside. Therefore, the Yetzer Hara coils and entangles itself between the body, Nephesh, and the Ruach, spirit. And its enmity is against the woman, that is, against the soul, the Neshama. The Zohar presents the serpent as an image of Satan/Yetzer Hara, and Samael riding the serpent. Sometimes he is associated with Lilith, a mysterious female demon who inhabited Eden according to Kabbalistic tradition, as Samael's female counterpart. This identification integrates the serpent into the universe of the Sitra Achra, side of impurity, or the dark side that was created in Genesis. In fact, if you want to learn more about this topic, I invite you to browse the playlist on our YouTube channel, Codigo Abel, and look for this year's Parashah Bereshit 2025, where we explain the origin of evil in Genesis. But we also have sources that are unusual for some, not for me or for academic researchers, in extra-biblical and apocryphal literature, Jewish and related, such as the apocryphal book Wisdom of Solomon 2:24, a Hellenistic Jewish text that states, "Through the devil's envy, death entered the world," one of the first passages linking the serpent/fall with the devil, a line later developed in Revelation 12:9 and 20:2. There is a philological debate about diabolos, a proper noun versus slanderer. Remember that many of these texts are available in late versions, that is, already translated into Greek or Latin, but probably, very likely, in their original Hebrew source. The word here was not devil, but Satan, or Satanas, and the meaning is accuser or adversary. But don't be confused. I'm not saying that according to the Bible and Kabbalah, evil doesn't exist. Quite the contrary. Evil is biblical. As Isaiah 45:7 states, God says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create adversity. Here in Hebrew it says evil. I, God, am the one who does all this. It couldn't be clearer. But what I want to make clear is that in the Bible, in Judaism, in Kabbalah, evil exists, yes, but it is created and controlled by God, because in the end, although illogical as it may seem, in the end, this evil created by God is controlled by Him and has a good end. So it is an apparent evil. Everything else is idolatry. Now, we continue in the apocryphal book, Life of Adam and Eve, Apocalypse of Moses, Latin, Slavic, and Armenian traditions. Expand on Genesis 3, and the devil, possibly a mistranslation of the demon Samael, uses the serpent as a vessel to deceive Eve. He introduces motivations, jealousy, rebellion, penances, and post-Eden promises. In the Book of Jubilees 3, retelling of Eden and the curse, traditions explain why animals, including the serpent, stop speaking after the expulsion. This is why there are midrashim that say that human sin, even today, has the power to harm its environment, nature. In fact, there is a source in Romans 8:22 that also affirms this. For we know that the whole creation groans and is in labor pains together until now. Another apocryphal source is Bel and the Dragon, an addition to Daniel. It narrates the destruction of a dragon/serpent worshipped in Babylon. It is critical of serpent cults. In the Gnostic tradition, Nag Hammadi, in hypostasis of the archons, the feminine principle, Sophia, enters the serpent, which acts as an instructor who communicates true knowledge, reversing the biblical and rabbinic interpretation. This is actually very late Christian literature, between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE, and we already find it in Coptic, but with a Greek background. So in this brief summary of the serpent in biblical and extra-biblical sources, there are some conclusions. In the Torah, the serpent circulates between real danger and pedagogical sign, punishment and cure, and is never explicitly identified with Satan, at least not literally. But in the rabbinic context, a plurality of interpretations persists, something very typical of rabbinic Judaism and its multiple interpretations, because the Torah has up to 70 faces, that is, up to 70 different ways of interpreting it, all of them valid. Thus, in rabbinic Judaism, which is a child of Second Temple Pharisaism, the serpent ranges from a cunning animal to a symbol of the evil impulse. The Midrash and the Zohar tend to personalize it. Kabbalah unifies the serpent with Satan and the Yetzer Hara on a single axis of ontological negativity. In Jewish apocryphal books, the serpent is demonized, wisdom, while in Gnostic texts, it can be positivized as an instructor, demonstrating that the symbol is disputed among traditions. Now, another way to view the serpent is as an internal metaphor. Mishnah Berakhot 5:1 teaches that even if a serpent entangles one's heel, it should not interrupt one's prayer. Classical exegesis, Talmud, Midrash, and medieval commentators did not limit itself to the literal meaning, physical danger from the animal, but rather read the serpent as a metaphor for inner turmoil, the distraction, desire, or improper thought, hirhurim ra'im, that coils itself in the mind of the worshipper. Thus, Nahash becomes an image of the Yetzer Hara that infiltrates during devotion, seeking to break concentration, kavanah. In Eden, the serpent introduces the deviant word that interrupts the dialogue between God and humankind. The Hebrew root nahash also alludes to whispering, divine, that is, the inner voice that whispers what is forbidden or vain. Therefore, the sages will see in the serpent the archetype of suggestion, of the voice that disturbs spiritual attention. In Numbers 21, the bronze serpent, Nahash Nehoshet, whoever looked up was healed. In mystical terms, this expresses that the remedy for the serpent, evil thought, is to raise one's gaze to the Creator, to elevate one's consciousness and intention. The Midrash Bereshit Rabbah 20 verse 7 states, Satan, the Yetzer Hara, and the angel of death are one and the same. And several sources state that the demon Samael rode upon the serpent in Eden, personifying man's inner impulse toward disobedience. Thus, during the Amidah, the mind is confronted with that same inner voice, material thoughts, worries, or fantasies that distract from kavanah. The halakha concerning the serpent on the heel is also interpreted as a symbol of disturbing thoughts. But Talmud teaches, a person prays only when his heart is focused on heaven. Berakhot 30b. A physical danger of the snake reflects the spiritual danger, losing connection with the divine presence, Shekinah, through distraction, fear, or your own yatzer, will cause it to entangle your body and soul. The Yetzer Hara is not the external devil, but rather the misguided energy of desire. The sages define it as the misdirected creative force, necessary for existence, but destructive if it dominates the mind. Creative force is understood as your imagination, the power of the mind, which can be used for kavanah meditations or for evil. It depends on you and only you. Zohar, Bereshit A, 1.36b to 37a, teaches, the serpent is the Yetzer Hara that whispers during prayer. It coils around man, just as he is preparing to praise the Creator. The metaphor is precise. The person praying rises, and the serpent ascends with him, attempting to bite the heel, the spiritual foundation, which is the Sephra Malkut. The Zohar identifies Hirhurim Raim, impure or vain thoughts, with the serpent's venom. Every distraction is a drop of the poison of Nachash, which chills devotion. Kabbalah teaches that the only cure is elevated kavanah, breathing with awareness of the divine name, fixing the mind on the purpose, kavanah, and visualizing the serpent transformed into a staff, like Moses's, Exodus 7:10-12, the energy of desire transformed into a force of holiness. Thus, we see that there is an internal struggle during the Amidah. Ethical authors, such as the Orchot Tzadikim, Meselat Yesharim, or Sharei Teshuvah, interpret prayer as a spiritual battlefield. The Yetzer Hara is the inner accuser, who seeks to make man mechanize his prayer. The serpent is the mental distraction that poisons the moment of intimacy with the divine. Resisting that voice is fulfilling the Mishna. Do not interrupt, not even if the serpent coils. The serpent, the Yetzer Hara, and evil thoughts are three expressions of the same principle, the force that diverts man's attention from his divine center. During the Amidah, which represents standing before the king, every distraction is a serpentine voice seeking to cut off communication. The act of not interrupting thus becomes an act of faith and inner mastery. That's it for today's class. Until the next video.